My name is Miles Hawthorne, and for the last 4 years I had sacrificed everything, my career, my social life, even the smallest fragments of my own identity to care for my wife, Cambria. Before the accident, she was a force of nature, razor-sharp in boardrooms, magnetic in conversation, impossible to overlook as she strode through life with the confidence of a woman who knew she had the world at her feet. Her presence filled rooms. Her laughter, when it came, was like crystal tearing through the air. I remember the way she would brush her hair back, arch an eyebrow at the slightest challenge, and command attention with a single, brilliant look. She was unsinkable until the night our car skidded off the road and shattered every certainty we ever had. In the harsh white light of the emergency room, I stood at her bedside watching surgeons work. My hands trembled as they stitched her wounds and reset her broken bones. The crash left her with nerve damage that doctors said might never fully heal. The paralysis crept through her legs like a slow poison, and within days she could no longer feel the warmth of the sun on her skin or the softness of our sheets beneath her knees. It wasn't just her body that changed. Her spirit, once incandescent, dimmed into a quiet ember, flickering under the weight of pain, of loss, of a future she could no longer control. I became something I never imagined. A full-time caregiver. I traded my tailored suits and boardroom battles for rubber gloves and pill schedules. I studied how to bathe her without causing pain, learned to navigate the labyrinth of insurance claims, and taught myself physical therapy routines by watching online tutorials in the quiet hours before dawn. I learned the precise angle at which to lift her so she wouldn't scream, the exact pressure needed to massage her frozen calves without tearing fragile muscle fibers. I became her cook, meticulously preparing nutrient-dense meals to combat the weight loss that had become a scarlet letter on our life together. I was her chauffeur, running errands, shuttling her to appointments miles from our home, praying no one noticed the trembling of my hands as I gripped the steering wheel. Our home became a shrine to survival rather than a sanctuary of love. The walls, once bright with expensive art and family photographs, stayed blank. The halls echoed with the hollow rhythm of my footsteps as I moved from one task to the next, never pausing to breathe. Each morning I woke before the sun, checked the time-stamped logs I'd kept overnight, her heart rate, her breathing, the number of hours she'd slept, and tried to steel myself for the day ahead. I'd climb the stairs to her room with my heart in my throat, knowing she might greet me with gratitude or, more often, a stare so empty it felt like glass cutting into my chest. We lived in silence, but it wasn't peace. The hush that settled over our days was the dull hum of survival, each second marked by the urgent needs of a life in stasis. I'd thought silence could be comforting, that in the absence of noise there would be room to heal. Instead, it was a cavern that swallowed our voices, our dreams, our marriage. We sat across from each other during meals, the only sound the mechanical whir of the stairlift she used to retreat to bed. I eyed her plate, wondering if she could taste the love I folded into every carefully portioned bite, and she stared at the ceiling as if the meal were a patron saint she could no longer favor with her devotion. Day after day I slipped into roles I had never auditioned for: nurse, therapist, advocate. Friends drifted away, unsure how to talk to me now that I spent every waking moment caring for someone other than myself. Family members sent cards and fruit baskets, then stopped calling when the baskets piled up and the cards remained unopened on the hallway table. I stopped answering the phone, thinking it better to isolate myself than to feel the ache of their pity. I surrendered my art classes, my weekend hikes, the evenings I once spent sketching the city skyline from my studio apartment. My identity dissolved into a list of duties. Feed her, bathe her, will her to appointments, administer medications, decipher oblique complaints about pain levels I could neither see nor soothe. And yet, even as resentment flickered through me like static, I clung to a slender hope that love meant never leaving, that devotion would triumph over tragedy. I reassured myself whenever exhaustion pressed my bones to the floor that I was performing the greatest act of love imaginable. I told myself that if I abandoned her now, I would abandon the woman I had vowed to protect. But late at night, as I lay curled beside her on the narrow hospital bed we'd kept in the spare bedroom, I felt the weight of it all pressing down until I couldn't draw breath. In those moments, I realized that some silences are prisons, and some acts of love can bury the very person you promised to save. The halls of our home remained empty, echoing with the hollow rhythm of a life tethered to duty. My hands, calloused and stained from years of washing, bear the map of every sacrifice I ever made. But in the quiet between her shallow breaths and my labored heartbeat, I wonder whether the life I saved was hers or my own. I thought love meant never leaving, no matter how hard it got. In the early days after Cambria's discharge from the hospital, I flitted between tasks like a frantic moth, convinced that my devotion alone could rekindle the spark that the accident had doused. I worked from home now, tethered to an endless stream of emails and conference calls that I silenced the moment her physical therapist arrived. My laptop perched on the mahogany dining table, once a gathering place for friends, became my command center, but only until the timer buzzed and I halted whatever I was doing to tend to Cambria's needs. Every morning I eased her into a wheelchair with practiced patience, wrapping her legs in a soft blanket against chills she no longer felt but complained about nonetheless. I guided her into the bathroom, helping her onto the specially installed bench and running the water. Then I washed her, soap gliding over bruised flesh and stitches I dreaded to imagine beneath the surface. After dressing her in loose garments to accommodate swollen joints and delicate skin, I spooned porridge into her mouth, coaxing her to eat with gentle encouragement and reminders that food was fuel for healing, even if she had lost the appetite to taste more than sorrow. My days blurred into a rhythm of feeding, lifting, administering medications, and charting progress on spreadsheets that tracked every nuance. Cambria's weight, her oxygen levels, the degrees of flexion in her once agile knees. I handled the insurance fights in what felt like a parallel life, wading through phone trees, submitting photocopies of medical records, and challenging denied claims. Every victory, a check approved, a specialist referral granted, felt hollow when I returned home to the hollow silence that greeted me like an accusation. Cambria's mother, Judith, called weakly as though she were performing an obligation. Her voice crackled through the speakerphone, laden with concern that felt more like judgment. "She's lost weight again," she'd say, her tone clinical, detached. "Are you even feeding her properly?" I clenched the phone so tightly I thought it might shatter, but I forced a calm response. "I'm monitoring her nutrition closely," I lied. The truth was I measured every tablespoon of soup, calibrated every spoonful of yogurt, yet it was never enough in Judith's exacting view. In her calls, Judith focused on Cambria's appearance, as though a thinner waistline signified moral failing. She never asked how I was holding up. She never inquired if I had eaten or slept or whether my own health was faltering under the strain. She spoke as though her daughter were a fragile object under my care rather than a woman with her own will and a husband who was, despite everything, still trying to love her. After each conversation, I sat in the empty living room with the phone still glowing in my palm, wondering when love became something measured in calories and medication adherence. Cambria never defended me. When Judith's barbed remarks pierced the air, Cambria would rest her gaze on the ceiling, lips pressed into a thin line as though my failures hurt her more than the pain that spread through her damaged nerves. She seldom looked at me anymore, as if I had become part of the furniture. Present but invisible, I longed for her voice, for the warmth of her laughter, for the quick exchanges that once hummed between us like a secret code. But her quiet was not the peace I had hoped for. It was a reminder that our partnership had splintered into routine and resentment. I rearranged our lives around her therapy schedule, morning sessions for balance and muscle strength, afternoons for occupational tasks like gripping utensils or buttoning shirts. I mapped out routes to avoid potholes and uneven sidewalks, fearful of jolts that might trigger pain or tears. Evenings I spent massaging her calves, talking her through phantom pains she insisted attacked her at night. I stroked her skin in gentle, circular motions and whispered affirmations I no longer believed in, telling her she could heal, that I was proud of her progress. She'd nod without conviction, eyes distant, and I'd swallow the ache that welled up in my chest. When work deadlines loomed, I carved out minutes, literally minutes, between appointments. I dashed from her side to join conference calls, voice clipped, thoughts fragmented by guilt. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the hallway mirror. Gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes, shoulders stooped under invisible weights. I barely recognized myself. Yet I pressed on, equating sacrifice with love, convinced that enduring this trial would prove our bond indestructible. Neighbors, when they saw us, offered sympathetic smiles that felt like mirrors reflecting my own despair. Friends dropped off casseroles and covered dishes and lit candles for Cambria's recovery, then slipped away when invitations to dinner went unanswered. I began to wonder if anyone truly understood what caregiving entailed, or if they saw only the noble concept of selflessness, not the day-to-day erosion of identity and joy. Late one night, I stood in the kitchen, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead as I weighed herbs for a bland stew. My hands shook, driven by exhaustion rather than nerves. I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of parsley and thyme, longing for a life where my husbandly duties did not eclipse my own humanity. In that moment, I recognized the truth. I had become a caretaker, not a husband. The intimacy we once shared. Words whispered in dark bedrooms, laughter over burnt toast, the thrill of spontaneous weekend getaways, had been replaced by a mechanical caretaking that neither of us wanted but neither could escape. I realized that love could not exist in a vacuum of obligations and resentments. It needed space to breathe, moments to flourish, the give and take that defined companionship. Our marriage had devolved into a ledger of tasks, minutes spent feeding, hours spent around medical equipment. It was a contract written in prescriptions and physical therapy notes, devoid of the warmth that had drawn us together. I turned off the stovetop and leaned against the counter, listening to the distant hum of the stairlift carrying Cambria to bed. I wanted to shout, to wake her from the silence, to remind her, and myself, that we were more than our roles. But exhaustion tightened around my throat, and all I could manage was a soft whisper, "This isn't how it's supposed to be." In the solitude of that kitchen, I understood that love requires moments, not just minutes, and that we had lost our moments long ago. As I prepared her meal in the pre-dawn hush, I resolved to find a way back to each other, or at least to reclaim enough of myself to survive the days relentlessly measured in caregiving tasks in the silence of a marriage held together by duty alone. I had saved every spare penny for months, determined to give Cambria one bright moment to remember who she once was before the darkness of immobility swallowed her spirit. I scoured glossy travel brochures, compared accessible resorts along the coast, and finally landed on an oceanfront property that boasted wheelchair ramps, adaptive equipment, and staff trained in medical care. I imagined her reclining on a terrace overlooking the sea, the salt breeze lifting the heavy weight from her chest, and for a moment, I believed I could manufacture happiness with a credit card and a clever itinerary. On the morning of her birthday, I packed our suitcases with her favorite clothes, flowing dresses and jewel tones that once made her feel regal, along with specialized cookware for the dietary plan I devised with a nutritionist. I double-checked the reservations. Massage sessions at 10, nutritional consultations at noon, daily yoga classes modified for limited mobility. I arranged for a chef who would prepare gluten-free, high-protein meals that even picky eaters would savor. I even installed a portable ramp at our front door to ensure we could roll her wheelchair into the car without a hitch. Every detail was a testament to my devotion, proof that I would move mountains for a vestige of her old self. We arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun sliding into the horizon like molten gold. The resort's white stucco walls glowed in the fading light, palm fronds rustling overhead. I parked by the ramp and helped Cambria into the reception area, where a hostess in crisp linen greeted us with a cool smile and whispered promises of rest and renewal. I felt a flicker of triumph. At least here, she would be waited on, pampered, freed from the clutches of our day-to-day routines. Our suite overlooked the turquoise waters of the Mediterranean. I wheeled her onto the balcony, where she rested against a pillow as I poured her a glass of her favorite lemon-infused water. The scent of lavender drifted from a nearby garden, and for a heartbeat, she closed her eyes and inhaled, the lines on her forehead softening. My chest swelled with relief. Maybe this would be the turning point. The moment she remembered that life could still hold beauty beyond hospital corridors and sterile appointments. That first evening, I escorted her to the beachfront restaurant where white linen tables were set directly on the sand under twinkling lanterns. A harpist played a soft melody as waiters in starched uniforms offered dishes I had requested weeks earlier. She nibbled at a poached fish fillet, then hesitated before pushing her chair back. I leaned in, ready to reassure her that everything was perfect, but she simply closed her eyes and rested her head against the back of her wheelchair. I took a bite of the food she declared too bland, and swallowed hard, the salt from the sea stinging my throat. Over the next 2 days, I juggled activities like a carnival performer, determined to fill each hour with therapeutic promise. A gentle massage eased the tension in her shoulders. A guided meditation on the beach promised mental clarity. A specially arranged art class on a shaded patio was supposed to awaken her creative side. I watched her plunge her hands into clay, attempting to mold shapes that never quite formed, her jaw jittering with frustration. I offered encouraging smiles, but she glared at me, narrowing her eyes as though I had orchestrated the entire charade to highlight her helplessness. I had packed books on resilience and grief, hoping she might find solace in stories of people who rebuilt their lives after trauma. She flicked through the pages, then slammed the book shut, tossing it aside like an unwelcome challenge. I found her sitting by the pool, shoulders slumped, her reflection shimmering in the water as if mocking the unspoken ache between us. I wheeled her back to the room, my heart pounding, but she refused to speak, staring blankly out at the horizon. On the fourth morning, I surprised her with a private breakfast on the beach, a tray laden with fresh fruit, eggs cooked to her liking, and a single red rose perched in a slender vase. I approached with a hopeful grin, reciting the lines I'd rehearsed, how grateful I was for her, how proud I'd always be, how this retreat was my gift of love. She looked at the rose, then at me, her lips twisting into a cold smile. "Overpriced nonsense," she muttered, the words crackling through the dawn air like a verdict. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I remembered. My chest tightened so sharply I thought I might collapse. All those hours of planning, all those sacrifices, I felt them collapse in an instant. I bent to collect the rose, attempting to soften the moment. "I thought you'd like it," I said, voice small. She flicked her hand. "You bought me expensive nonsense and called it loving me. I'm tired of your pity gifts." The voice that hurt most was not her accusation, but the indifference laced within her words. I realized then that my gift had been baked in guilt, not affection, and it had landed with the weight of obligation. That afternoon, I wandered alone along the shoreline, letting the tide lap at my shoes. I listened to the crash of waves and felt the sun burn my shoulders as I replayed every moment of the trip. I saw how the resort's polished corridors, the pastel cocktails, the gentle therapists, all these were amusements for my sake, not hers. She resented being coddled. She longed for control, for autonomy. I had not secured her freedom. I had imprisoned her beneath the veneer of luxury. Back in the room, I packed the bags with shaking hands. I resealed our plans. I canceled the remaining excursion scheduled for a sunset boat ride. I removed the fancy linens I'd folded with such care. When Cambria returned from her therapy session, she found me sitting on the bed, the room stripped of its illusion. I handed her a crumpled receipt and whispered, "We're going home." Her eyes widened, then slicked with tears, tears I could neither confirm as relief nor sorrow. She said nothing, but for the first time, she looked directly at me. On the drive back, the car hummed along empty coastal roads as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. I glanced at Cambria in the rearview mirror. Her face was a blank canvas, unreadable. I understood then that love could not be purchased or arranged. It could only be lived, moment by moment, in shared laughter or shared pain. This retreat had not rekindled her spirit, it had broken me. I had tried to craft a perfect interlude, but perfection is a myth when two hearts have lost their way. When we crossed the threshold of our home that night, the walls looked the same, empty, echoing with the dull hum of silence. I set her wheelchair down, turned off the porch light, and stood in the dark until the sound of her breathing guided me back inside. I resolved that from now on, I would stop chasing grand gestures and start offering genuine presence. No more retreats, no more perfect schedules, just the fragile honesty of two people trying to find their way back to each other in the wreckage of their shared life. Cambria stopped celebrating our anniversaries long before I realized what I was losing. The calendar on my phone still pinged reminders, 5 years since our wedding, 6, 7, but she never asked if I remembered. I would light candles and play the song we danced to that first night, then watch her stare past me as though I were a stranger in her life. The grand gestures, handwritten cards, surprise dinners, impromptu drives to nowhere fell flat against the wall of indifference she built around herself. I learned to stop planning celebrations I would attend alone. She stopped asking how I was doing, though if I hadn't already been trained in emotional invisibility, I'm sure the weight of our existence would have crushed me. I woke before dawn to log into work calls, then rushed through my day to bathe her, change her bandages, and accompany her to appointments. Each evening, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, exhausted and hollow, longing for a partner to share a word of kindness, a laugh, a moment that reminded me our lives had once intertwined with warmth rather than routine. But Cambria lay in bed, eyes closed against the ceiling light, while I tiptoed to my side and tried to slip beneath the covers without waking her. She stopped noticing the small things. The way my hair grew long when I forgot to shave, the fact that I lost 15 pounds from grief rather than health, the nights when I canceled my art classes because I felt guilty leaving her alone even for an hour. I learned to dress in muted colors to avoid adding any burden to her gaze, to speak in hushed tones so I wouldn't startle her from her perpetual state of quiet. She called my job cute, a descriptor that felt like a slap across the face. My position as a freelance illustrator had supported us through unexpected medical bills, but to her it was no more than a hobby I indulged in when caregiving tasks were done. When I mentioned an upcoming commission, she shrugged and turned away, as though my achievements belonged to someone else. Her laughter, when it came, was reserved for phone calls I wasn't supposed to hear. I occasionally caught snippets through thin walls. Her voice rising with amusement, the click of her tongue against her teeth as she traded jokes with friends from before the accident. I recognized the melody of her laughter, a sound that once felt like sunbeams breaking through storm clouds, but now it stung more than her silence. Every giggle felt like a betrayal, proof that she could still find joy, but refused to share it with me. I pleaded silently for the sound to drift through our bedroom door, but it never did. Instead, it bounced down the hallway into someone else's world. I became a ghost in the house I once filled with memories of our life together. The photos on the mantel, the wedding portrait, snapshots of vacations, snapshots of laughter gathered dust, their colors fading like the memories they represented. I passed by them each day, aching to turn back time to when Cambria's hand slipped into mine and our fingers intertwined seamlessly. Now, I traced the grooves in the wood where her wheelchair wheels left marks, mapping out the paths of my captivity, from the bedroom to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the bathroom, from the bathroom to the living room where she sat like a ruler atop a throne. I tried to break free in small ways. I ventured outside to paint in plein air, setting up an easel on the front lawn at dawn and capturing the blush of sunrise with trembling strokes. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, puzzled by the solitary figure at the edge of a driveway. I painted scenes of freedom, rolling hills, open skies, birds in flight, in contrast to the walls of our home. But when the smell of oil paint reached Cambria's room, she called out for me, and I abandoned the canvas mid-sunrise to roll her to the living room for tea. Our interactions dwindled to a script of caregiving. Meal times, therapy schedules, medication checks. I learned the rigid sequence. Breakfast at 8, physical therapy at 10, lunch at noon, rest at 2, cognitive exercises at 4, dinner at 6. I timed my breaks between tasks to answer client emails, and on the rare occasion I spoke to a friend, I whispered so softly, I'm sure they heard the fragility in my voice. I stopped discussing my dreams, stopped sharing my worries. There was no room for my emotions in her ordered world. I tried to suggest we take a short walk once a week, using a walker she hadn't touched since discharge, but she refused, muttering that she already walked too much in therapy. When I lost my temper once, snapping at her to acknowledge me, to say anything that wasn't bitterness, I saw the fear in her eyes. She recoiled as though I were a stranger, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. Guilt sank into me like quicksand, pulling me under. I ran to the spare bedroom and slammed the door, breathing hard as tears stung my eyes. In that room, with nothing but white walls and the dull hum of the air filter, I realized I had become a caretaker, not a husband, not the man who once made her laugh with silly jokes, not the partner who held her hand through life's triumphs, not the confidant she used to trust with her anxieties. I remembered who I had been. An architect of dreams, a storyteller, a man who believed that life was best lived hand in hand with someone who shared your hopes. Now, each day was blueprint and script, drafted by necessity rather than love. I watched the calendar fill with appointments for her next surgery, her next round of therapies, and I saw myself disappear in the margins. One night, I stayed up late, cobbling together a letter I never intended to send. I wrote about the man I used to be, the dreams I buried beneath caregiving chores, the laughter I craved, the love I still felt despite everything. I scribbled apologies and questions, asking whether she even remembered the vows we exchanged, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. I addressed the letter to her, and slid it into an envelope I tucked into my coat pocket. Then I moved on without sending it, afraid that if she read my words, she would see the fracture in our marriage too clearly, and perhaps cease to care at all. By the time dawn arrived, I had folded the letter back into the pages of my journal and returned to my routine. I rolled her wheelchair into the kitchen, fixed her tea, and greeted her with a gentle smile as though nothing had changed. But inside, I carried the letter like a wound, a reminder that love cannot survive in a void of acknowledgement and shared moments. Her world had become mine, a prison from which there was no parole, unless I found a way to reclaim our love or to reclaim myself. I did not yet know which path I would choose, only that I could not continue on this silent, unending march through caretaking duties without losing the man I once was. It was a Tuesday, though the days had long since blurred into an indistinguishable succession of mornings and evenings marked only by our routines. I stood at the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled to my elbows, scrubbing grease from yesterday's dinner pots. My hands ached from the repetition, waterproofed my skin, and yet each scrub brought a new twinge in the joints that reminded me I wasn't as young as I used to be. The house was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the steady drip of the faucet. I liked these quiet moments, a brief reprieve from the demands of caregiving. In silence, I could pretend I still had a life beyond this house. Cambria's new phone lay face down on the counter, a sleek slab of metal and glass I had surprised her with weeks earlier when I managed overtime hours to cover the cost. She hadn't thanked me, she rarely acknowledged anything I did anymore. But I told myself she appreciated the gesture in her own way. I paused to wipe a water droplet from the screen, tapping it gently with the edge of my shirt. The surface gleamed in the overhead light, then pinged softly as if inhaling my attention. A voicemail autoplayed, triggered by the slightest touch. I froze, dishcloth in hand, as the muffled voice spilled through the speaker. At first, I thought it was some random wrong number. A warm male voice, confident and familiar, said something about a plan unfolding. Then the words landed with the weight of an anchor sinking in deep water. "So you really think Miles still has no idea?" the man said, tone laced with amusement. That poor idiot. My heart clenched so tightly, I nearly dropped the dishcloth into the suds. I pressed pause. No, there was no pause button on this phone. It looped back to the beginning. I slapped the screen to stop it, and the voice cut off, leaving only the echo of its last cruel syllable. I sank onto a kitchen stool, my back protesting, and stared at the phone. My breath came rapid, shallow. Cambria's phone, the very device I bought to give her a connection to the outside world, had captured a confession about me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I pressed my palm to my brow, wondering how long this recording had sat in her inbox. I tried to steady my breathing, counting in my head like I used to do when panic threatened to swallow me. 1, 2, 3, but the numbers slipped away. I remembered the night I installed the voicemail app, showing her how to swipe and tap, explaining that we could save recordings in case of emergencies. I had sat beside her on the couch, our knees almost touching, and wrapped my arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me in that moment, and I thought I felt a shiver of the old warmth. But now I wondered if that moment was just a mirage, conjured by longing rather than reality. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and tried to stand, but my legs wobbled. I leaned against the counter, scanning the wall clock. 2:47 p.m. Physical therapy was at 3. I had 20 minutes to decide how to handle this, and I didn't know what to do. Confrontation had never been my forte. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to hold me upright. I grabbed the phone, pressed the voicemail icon, and scrolled through a folder of messages I had never thought to check. There were memos to herself, harmless notes about pain levels and therapy times. And then another message from the same voice. "He's so easy to guilt. I keep hinting I'm too fragile for him to leave. He buys it every time." My stomach lurched. I dropped into a chair, knees tucked to my chest, holding the phone like it was a bomb about to explode. That voice was not just an intruder. It was a witness to a deception I had never suspected. I reflected on every time I had bathed her, spooned her soup, steadied her trembling body in the morning light, each act now tainted by doubt. If she believed I was gullible, that I could be manipulated with false weakness, then what did that make me? A fool. A marionette dancing on strings she and this Logan the therapist had pulled for their amusement? My eyes stung as I pressed play on the next message, and Cambria's voice, softer but no less cruel, rose through the speaker. "He's so trained now. I had to convince him not to accept that gallery job in Barcelona. I said I needed him for appointments. He believed me, so gullible. My chest constricted. The gallery job, the one I declined to stay by her side, convinced she truly needed me more than I needed my own ambitions. I had shelved invitations, deferred commissions, and uprooted my life for what I thought was love. Instead, I had been lured into captivity. I staggered to my feet, blood roaring in my ears, and shoved the kitchen chair backward. The microwave beeped, reminding me breakfast was still on its plate. I grabbed a dish towel and flung it across the counter, then punched the wall next to the cabinet, hard enough to make my knuckles ring. Pain blossomed in my hand, but I barely noticed. I swiped through Cambria's contacts to find Logan, but the name was hidden under PT support, a cloak for his duplicity. I stared at the screen, white and sterile, and felt rage bloom inside me so hot it dazzled my vision. And then something shifted. I remembered how I had felt on the day of the accident, helpless, furious at the unfairness of life. I had clawed at uncertainty then, refusing to let grief define our future. Now, confronted with betrayal, I felt the same steel ignite in my veins. I straightened, squared my shoulders, and tucked the phone into my pocket. I would not let this continue. I would find out how deep the deception went and reclaim whatever fragments of my life remained. At precisely 3 o'clock, I rolled into the therapist's office beside Cambria, who eyed me with a practiced mix of surprise and disdain. I ignored the comment I saw poised on her lips and steered her wheelchair toward one of the padded treatment tables. As Logan's cheery voice called my name from behind, I sat hard in a nearby chair and laid my phone on the table between us. With deliberate calm, I pressed play. The office fell silent except for the taunting replay of Logan's voice. Cambria's eyes widened, shade for the first time since the accident, but she said nothing. Logan stammered apologies and began to stutter excuses, but I held up a hand, cutting him off. My voice was steady, each syllable infused with a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. This ends now. In that moment, I realized that betrayal can be a turning point, a fracture in the foundation of trust that, once exposed, can never be ignored. The water had spoken through the voicemail, and I could no longer pretend I didn't hear its secrets. The truth hurt, but it freed me from the silence I had been drowning in. And as Logan fumbled for words and Cambria stared at her lap, I understood that sometimes the most courageous act of love is not to stay, but to demand honesty, no matter the cost. When I unlocked Cambria's phone, her stubborn loyalty to our old passcode, my birthday, finally paying off, I felt a flicker of triumph before dread rushed in to snuff it out. I tapped through her voice memo folder, each entry labeled with dates and snippets of text I had never thought to examine. The first few were mundane. Reminders about medication timing, notes on her pain levels, recordings of her rattled breathing after a particularly brutal therapy session. I pressed play on each one, my throat constricting as her muted voice filled the speakers, confessing fears and frustrations to no one but herself. I scrolled down until I found the folder labeled Notes, then froze when I recognized the name Logan etched across the top of the latest memo. I held my breath as I tapped the play button. Logan's voice, silky and mocking, wound its way through the static. He still thinks you're struggling to stand? Damn, you've got him trained. My stomach churned, a kettle of bile rising in my mouth. I forced myself to listen, to absorb each syllable that chipped away at my confidence and my love. I met every cruel phrase with the steady grip of my finger on the pause icon, determined to let nothing slip away unheard. Then Cambria's voice emerged from the hush, slow and husky. He's so easy to guilt. I keep hinting I'm too fragile for him to leave. He buys it every time. I pressed play on the next message, if only to confirm that my mind hadn't deceived me. Logan's chuckle crackled through the phone. What about the Barcelona exhibit? You told him you needed him for rehab. Cambria answered, soft as porcelain breaking. I convinced him not to take that gallery job in Barcelona. Said I needed him. He believed me. So gullible. My heart pounded, echoing in my ears like a thunderclap. The gallery job, my dream commission, the one I declined to anchor myself to her side, had been the prize in their cruel game. I sank onto the armrest of the sofa, legs trembling beneath me, and clutched the phone as though it were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Each message felt like a fresh blow. I replayed the betrayal over and over, mapping every betrayal to the countless nights I lay awake listening for her breathing, willing her to recover. Each task I performed, washing her hair, spooning soup into her mouth, shuttling her between appointments, had wrapped me tighter in a cocoon she and Logan wove to keep me from leaving. I had lived under the illusion of necessity, believing my sacrifice was acknowledged and cherished, not manipulated and ridiculed. I closed my eyes and let tears burn down my cheeks, each drop a confession of my own gullibility. When I finally stood, the room spun beneath me, and I staggered to the kitchen counter for support. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my shirt and stared at my reflection in the window glass. The man who looked back was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his features drawn tight by loss and disillusionment. I seldom recognized him anymore, the caregiver, the unpaid therapist, the spouse whose worth was measured in the efficiency of his service. In that reflection, I saw someone I could no longer afford to be. I returned to the living room and sank onto the sofa beside Cambria's wheelchair as she rolled in from a therapy session, her face expressionless. The phone lay on the coffee table between us, a knell calling for truth. She caught my gaze and tilted her head, puzzled, as though I were an actor reading from a script she had never approved. I didn't speak. My silence was more damning than any accusation. I watched her pulse quicken as she realized something was wrong, the first sign of humanity I'd seen from her in weeks. "Cambria," I said finally, my voice low but unyielding. "What is this?" I pushed the phone toward her, replaying the messages until her eyes flickered with confusion, then panic, then anger. Logan's mocking taunt filled the room again. So gullible. The words lingered, twisting between us like barbed wire. Cambria's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She looked away, as though ashamed, or maybe afraid of the love she once claimed. I felt tears spring in my eyes once more, but this time they carried a different weight. Not the sorrow of a man deceived, but the steel of someone waking to his own strength. I took a deep breath and said, "I believed in us. I believed in you. But I was wrong. I will no longer be your fool." My hands stilled on the sofa's edge, knuckles white. I studied her face, searching for any flicker of remorse, but found only the hollow echo of who she used to be. Without another word, I rose and walked toward the bedroom. I paused by the wardrobe, running my fingers over the jackets I had hung there, each one a testament to the life I had set aside. I felt the pulse of betrayal as I slipped into my coat pocket the keys to our home and the family car. When I returned to the living room, Cambria sat rigid in her wheelchair, her eyes glinting with tears I could not name. I knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "I will arrange for your care," I said, voice steady. "But I will not be part of this deception anymore." She opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. No more lies. No more manipulation. I stood and turned toward the door, steeling myself for the journey ahead. As I walked away, I understood that betrayal can be the spark that ignites a long-dormant flame of self-respect. I stepped through the front door into the cool air, the evening sky streaked with rose and gold, and felt the first rush of freedom in years. I had been trained to endure, but now I would learn to live. I arrived in Valencia on a humid evening that smelled of orange blossoms and sea salt. The train from Barcelona had rattled past sunlit vineyards and terracotta rooftops, delivering me to a city vibrating with life and possibility, so unlike the hushed emptiness I had fled. I dragged my duffel bag down the narrow street toward the small flat I had rented in El Carmen, the old quarter where artists and dreamers gathered. The building's ochre facade was draped in trailing bougainvillea, and through the wrought iron balcony railings I heard laughter drifting from a cafe below. I inhaled deeply, tasting freedom for the first time in years. My new home was modest, a single room, with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a wall of windows that flooded the space with late afternoon light. I set my bag on the floor and unzipped it, pausing to touch the worn leather of my sketchbook and the bristles of my favorite brushes. I arranged them on a makeshift desk by the window, careful as though I were threading pearls. Then I moved to the blank section of wall opposite the window and propped up a canvas I had packed with me, a mid-sized panel primed and waiting. In that silent room, I felt a stirring I hadn't known in years, the pulse of creation. I dipped a brush in water and swirled it against a tube of cobalt blue, testing the color on the canvas. The first stroke was hesitant, a single mark that trembled across the white surface. But then the second stroke was bolder, and soon the panel began to transform. Layers of blue gave way to strokes of burnt sienna, vivid streaks of emerald green weaving in like new shoots breaking through soil. I lost track of time as I painted my first piece in what felt like a lifetime, a landscape echoing the rolling hills outside the city, the pastel rooftops, the promise of dawn. Sweat beaded on my forehead, my heart raced, and I realized I hadn't felt this alive since before the accident. That night, I carried my painting down the narrow winding streets to a small tapas bar that doubled as an informal gallery for local artists. The owner, Manuel, stood behind the counter polishing glasses and greeted me by name. He had seen my work online, pieces I had posted before the retreat debacle, and offered me a wall space, rent-free for a month. "You need a showcase," he said, smiling. "Let the city see your vision." I handed him my painting with shaking hands. His eyes widened at the contours and the light in the piece. "You have talent," he said. "I'll hang this tonight." Over the next weeks, my routine took shape organically. I woke with the sunrise and walked barefoot on the cool terrace of my building, watching gulls wheel above terracotta spires. I brewed strong coffee, then painted until the city awoke. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had surrendered to duty and manipulation. I experimented with color, fiery oranges that flirted with reds, deep violets that whispered of midnight confidences. My canvases lined the walls of the tapas bar, where locals paused mid-conversation to study them, murmuring in Spanish I only half understood. By mid-morning, I ventured to the Mercado Central, the sprawling farmers' market, to buy fresh produce and chat with vendors who offered fruit samples and joked about my accent. I practiced Spanish with them, stumbling over verb conjugations, but they laughed kindly and corrected me. For the first time, I felt accepted rather than pitted. I watched families wheel children through aisles of citrus and olives, the chatter alive with warmth and community. It struck me how different this was from the sterile corridors of therapy centers and the hush of my former home. Here, life pulsed in every corner. Afternoons I attended my first gallery show. A tight circle of patrons gathered in a converted warehouse, sipping wine and examining abstract sculptures. I recognized Isla then, the curator who had invited me after seeing my work in Catalonia. She wore a simple black dress and an amber pendant that caught the low light. She guided me through the exhibit, pointing out emerging talent and asking me what drew me to certain pieces. I spoke haltingly, but she listened as though each word mattered. When we reached my canvas, she paused, studying its color harmonies, the tension between form and freedom. She turned to me and said, "Your work speaks of transformation. I want to feature you in our spring show." My chest tightened with pride and disbelief. I stammered out a thank you, and she smiled, her eyes warm and encouraging. She never asked about Cambria or the betrayal. She only saw the man I was becoming. I realized then that I had entered a space governed by new rules. No guilt, no hidden agendas, just art and honest connection. Evenings I retreated to my flat, where the windows glowed with street lamps and the distant melody of Spanish guitar drifted through the air. I sketched thumbnails of future paintings, my mind alive with landscapes and portraits waiting to be born. For the first time, I allowed myself to dream of galleries in Paris, commissions from private collectors, a life where my art defined me rather than my sacrifices. I felt the knots of tension in my shoulders ease, the lines around my eyes soften. I slept deeply 8 hours without the nightmares of crawling through corridors or the echo of voicemail betrayals. 2 months later, the opening night of the spring show arrived. I dressed in a crisp white shirt and navy trousers, my first new outfit in years, and walked into the gallery with Isla at my side. The room was awash in applause as she introduced me, explaining how a tragic betrayal had led me to transform pain into beauty. As I spoke about my journey, about rusted hands and empty halls, about the courage to walk away and the freedom to create, I felt my voice steady with conviction. The audience listened, rapt, and I realized that my story resonated because it was not just mine. It was the story of anyone who has had to reclaim themselves from the bonds of duty and deception. After the show, buyers approached me, offering to purchase paintings on the spot. Isla beamed, arranging sales and interviews. I watched the colors I had poured my soul into find new homes on living room walls, in office lobbies, in the hearts of strangers. I remembered sitting alone in that spare bedroom crafting a list of escape and understood that those tasks were the first strokes on the new canvas of my life. As guests filtered out and the lights dimmed, I stood alone in the center of the gallery, surrounded by my work. The silence was not the prison I once knew. It was a canvas waiting for the next stroke. I breathed in the calm, feeling the steady beat of my own heart. I had walked away once, but now I was home. Home within myself, within my art, within a world that welcomed me not as a caretaker ghost, but as a man who painted his own destiny with unapologetic hues of hope. The first email arrived 6 weeks after I'd settled into my new life in Valencia. I was painting a commission, a stormy seascape in oil, when my phone buzzed on the windowsill. The sender's name, Cambria Hawthorne, flickered across the screen like a flare in the night. I paused, brush in midair, and stared for a moment before tapping to open it. "You abandoned your wife." The message began, terse and accusatory. My heart clenched, the memory of our final conversation surging back like a tidal wave. I set the brush down and read on. "You will regret this. Don't forget our vows." There was no warmth, no plea. Only cold admonition delivered from a distance of hundreds of miles. I felt a tug of something I'd thought long buried. Guilt. But then I remembered the voice memos, the betrayal, the years of manipulation. I closed the email without replying and returned to my canvas, the bristles catching on wet paint as I forced my hand steady. 3 days later, another email arrived. This time from Judith, her tone even colder. "You owe her. She still needs you." The message contained an attachment. A scant letter from one of Cambria's doctors, pleading for continuity of care and emphasizing her fragile condition. Judith wrote that I was shirking my responsibilities, that abandoning my wife was not only cruel but legally indefensible. My chest tightened as I glanced at the pressed flowers in a frame on my windowsill, gifts from Isla after my first solo exhibition. The contrast between the petals' fragile beauty and the harshness of Judith's words made me wince. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text message from an unknown number. "Miles, it's Logan. I'm hearing you've left Cambria high and dry. We were supposed to be a team against the world." Rage coursed through me at the thought of hearing his voice again, a reminder that he had been complicit in breaking my spirit. I deleted the text without a second thought. That evening, I called Beatrice. She answered immediately, her voice warm but businesslike. I relayed the threats, the accusations, the barrage of emails and messages designed to intimidate. She sighed. "They're casting a wide net, trying to guilt you into returning." She explained the power of documentation. Every email, every text, every attachment would serve to demonstrate the pattern of harassment and manipulation. "We'll file a restraining order if necessary," she assured me. "For now, do not respond to them." I thanked her and hung up, feeling both relief and unease. Legal recourse offered protection, but it also cemented the distance between me and any hope of reconciliation. I painted late into the night, using thick impasto strokes to give weight to the turmoil swirling inside me. I realized that their attempts to pull me back had only confirmed that I was right to leave. A week later, the calls began. My phone rang with private numbers, 7 calls in as many days, each ending in silence when I answered. I traced the numbers back to a clinic near my old home, confirming my suspicion that it was Logan dialing on Cambria's behalf. The echo of his voice in a silent line filled me with a resolve that hardened like dried paint. Then came the letters. Plain envelopes, white and crisp, stamped with the postmark of my former city. Inside were printed copies of medical reports, notes on Cambria's progress, records of surgeries, therapy schedules, all sent by Judith's assistant. The letters carried a demand: return and resume your duties or face legal and moral consequences. I placed each envelope in a box I labeled evidence, tucking it beneath my desk. Through it all, Isla remained a steady presence. She noticed the tension in my shoulders, the way I flinched when my phone chimed. One afternoon, she found me hunched over my laptop, drafting another response to Beatrice. She pulled me from my chair and led me to a bench overlooking the Turia Gardens. The sunlight danced on the riverbed stones, and she slipped her hand into mine. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "They have no claim on you." I exhaled, releasing a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I realized that their calls and letters were less about Cambria's welfare and more about control. By attacking me from afar, they hoped to shackle me with obligation and guilt. Instead, their efforts served as a testament to the cruelty I had escaped. I spent the next morning drafting a concise letter, my first direct response to Cambria and Judith. I kept it factual and impersonal. I outlined the timeline of care, cited the evidence of their emotional manipulation, and stated unequivocally that I would no longer serve as Cambria's caregiver. I attached a copy of the legal cease and desist notice we'd filed and sent it via certified mail. That afternoon, I found clarity. I mixed fresh colors on my palette. Sun-washed ochres, vibrant magentas, shadows of indigo, and painted a new piece, a lone figure standing on a cliff overlooking a boundless ocean, hair whipped by the wind, arms spread wide in defiance. The canvas captured my release, the moment when a man sheds chains and faces the horizon with unflinching courage. A month passed without incident. The emails stopped, the calls ceased, and the letters no longer arrived. Judith's attempts at legal action foundered when Beatrice submitted evidence of Cambria's functional capacity and proof of her own emotional manipulation. The court dismissed the petitions, and Logan, having lost his position at the clinic amid professional misconduct allegations, vanished from contact. One evening, I received a final email from Cambria, subject line peace. Its body read simply, "I'm sorry. I was lost. I hope you find what was taken from you. No demands, no recriminations." Only an echo of the woman I once loved. I read it 3 times, feeling a mix of sorrow and closure. I forwarded it to Beatrice and then deleted it from my inbox. That night, I carried my latest painting to the Tapas Gallery, where Manuel greeted me with a grin. "They came calling?" he asked, nodding at the loudness of the piece. I laughed, a sound free of bitterness, and hung the canvas in a place of honor. Patrons passed by, pausing to admire the defiant figure, unaware of the story beneath its layers. I realized that their attempts to drag me back had only propelled me forward. Their voices, once so loud in my mind, faded into whispers drowned out by the cadence of my own heartbeat. The silence that followed was not an absence, but a sanctuary, where I could create, breathe, and simply be. And so, in the quiet after their storm, I discovered the truest freedom of all. The ability to live on my own terms, painting my destiny one brushstroke at a time. It had been over a year since the last message from Cambria, a year since I closed the door on our life of obligations and betrayals and drove toward an uncertain horizon. In that time, I had built a new existence on the canvas of Valencia's light, exhibitions, commissions, friendships born of honest connection. Yet nothing compared to the quiet that settled over me each morning in my studio apartment, where the only sounds were the rustle of brushes in a jar and the gentle hum of the city outside. I woke now without dread, without the ache of unspoken resentments, only the calm pulse of possibility. My routine began with coffee made strong enough to cut through any lingering remnants of sleep. I poured it into a chipped ceramic mug I had purchased from a local artisan, its handle worn smooth by use. As I sipped, I gazed out the window onto the narrow street below, where shopkeepers rolled down shutters and vendors wheeled carts of fresh produce. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, anchoring me to the rhythm of a life that was mine alone. No demands awaited me, no manipulations whispered from a screen. Only the promise of a blank canvas waiting to be filled. After breakfast, I unlocked the door to my makeshift studio. A repurposed storage closet with high ceilings and skylights that bathed the room in natural light. I lined up my recent works along the walls, a portrait of a fisherman hauling nets at dawn, an abstract swirl of cobalt and gold inspired by moonlight on the sea, a vivid depiction of windblown poppies in spring. Each painting was a chapter in my journey, a testament to the man I had become once I reclaimed my voice. I selected a large linen canvas and began the first strokes of my latest piece. A serene interior, empty except for a single wooden chair and a leaning easel. The light poured through an unseen window, illuminating the vacant room, casting elongated shadows that stretched toward the viewer. As I worked, the silence enveloped me like a warm cloak. In that hush, I felt neither loneliness nor longing, but a sense of belonging, to myself, to my art, to the world I was shaping with every brushstroke. Around midday, I broke for lunch and walked to a nearby cafe, where I ordered tapas of grilled artichoke hearts and patatas bravas. The owner greeted me by name and asked about my upcoming show. I smiled, recounting the details I had already memorized, and he nodded approvingly as he poured my glass of local red wine. I ate slowly, savoring each bite, pleased to notice how fully I existed in the moment. No guilt, no fear, no shadowed memories of sterile hospital rooms. On the walk back, I paused at the Turia Gardens, where children chased pigeons and elderly couples strolled hand in hand. I found a bench beneath an orange tree and sketched quick studies of passers-by, a woman in a flowing scarf, a man reading a newspaper, a group of teenagers laughing over ice cream. I chose each line with care, not to capture perfection, but to honor the simplicity of everyday life. The world felt new to me, alive with detail I had once overlooked in my former life of regimented duties. Evening in Valencia carried its own magic. The sky turned lavender and then deep indigo as street lamps flickered on. I returned to my apartment, prepared a simple meal of sautéed vegetables and rice, and ate at the small table by the window. Across the street, neighbors sang from their balconies, and the scent of jasmine drifted in through the open window. I felt connected to the city, to the world, to the hum of life thriving around me. Before bed, I sat at my desk and opened the duffel bag I had packed on that night I decided to leave. Inside were my first brushes, stained with old paint, and a tattered notebook containing the escape list I had written in anger and desperation. I reread it briefly, then closed the bag and placed it atop a high shelf. The items inside were relics of a past I honored but no longer needed. I stood at the window and looked out one last time before turning off the light. The silence that filled the room was not empty. It was the sound of breath, of heartbeat, of freedom finally claimed. I realized that some stories end not with fire or fury, but with the gentle grace of peace. And in that silence, I found home.